All right. Welcome back, everyone, to another Learning Tech Talks where we are living at the intersection of business, technology, and the human experience. I'm looking forward to today's conversation for a number of reasons. But before I get started, just as a heads up, if you listened last week, you know that I talked about some of the changes I'm going to be making to the format of the show. More to come on what that looks like and where things are going. Something else I just want to make people aware of is I've started a Substack where I plan on actually taking the show and digesting it down into basically a snackable takeaway for each one of these episodes so that you can follow along. And if you don't have a chance to catch the whole thing, you can at least get the TLDR version of it. So I will share those links in the show description if you're watching or listening. But I would encourage you all to follow along as things continue to evolve. Now, transitioning over to today's conversation, I'm joined by Raj Jha again, who Raj, great to have you back. We had a ton of fun on our last one, and we're going to be talking about the state of where the XR space is right now, which, for those who don't know, is an umbrella term for all the different realities that we're going to talk about. But we're also going to talk about what that looks like as AI has stepped onto the main stage, because for a lot of people, it sucked the air out of the room and they thought, hey, maybe that whole XR thing was just a fad. And it's not. And we're going to get into why it's not. So, Raj, thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here with you again, Chris.
Yeah, well, we're going to have fun just like we did last time. But for those who don't know who you are and maybe didn't catch the first episode with you and I, little bit of background into you and how you ended up, like, why did you end up getting into the XR space?
Sure. Okay. So back in the 2000, 2000 to 2008, 9, I was another company that was focused on building simulation software for enterprises so that companies like Toyota, Boeing, Porsche, they could build their products on the computer using physics simulations rather than building them in the real world. And that meant that they could get their work done 10 times better, faster, cheaper. And it's a big deal. And I saw in that industry that software that can simulate the real world has huge power. And I learned a lot, but thought that simulation should play a much bigger role, and especially in education, because I grew up, I wouldn't be where I am today without a great education system, both in India and the US. That I saw that simulation should be used everywhere in every classroom, every corporate training facility, and I wanted to accelerate that. So that was the inspiration behind starting the company. So
Okay.
the word STEM right in the beginning. Um, that's kind of the beginning. Right now, I'm leading Sim Insights, and we'll talk about the kinds of AR, VR, and AI powered simulation software that we're
So when
building.
you were there, so you were building simulation, and I think it's also important because a lot of times that word simulation can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different folks. So when you say you were building simulations at Toyota, what for what purpose and who is your audience that you were doing that for?
Sure. So you think about the way BMW drives differently than Toyota Corolla, or a sport version of a car drives differently than the other type. There are two ways to do it. One is you race the car on the racetrack. It has all these sensors, they gather data. And the other way is that you run a simulation of that car on the computer, and the
Okay.
computer gives you all the graphs. What I was doing is working on products that would enable you to simulate. And from the simulation, you would 10,000 line graphs. You compare those with the experimental line graphs, and they'll all be line on line. And tough customers will make you sweat if there was a 5% difference between the simulation results and the experimental results. That was my line for many, many years.
Okay. Okay. So a lot of it really boiled down to because I mean, again, and this is whether you're talking about vehicles or people, testing things out in real life can be extremely resource intensive and not terribly scalable. I mean, the example you just gave right there of, hey, we just made this slight change to a vehicle. Let's see how it impacts the overall performance. Yeah, you can do that, but to do that over and over and over would just run you into the dirt. So the goal at that point was really to focus on how do we create computer models and simulations to actually be able to see how these things play out in the digital world to get the data without having to scale that up.
Yeah.
What
And
made
to
you
me, the
go for it?
do it with fidelity, because that matching between the simulation and the reality, that's the fidelity.
So on that topic, I'm really curious because now we'll stick to the technical, right? Let's stick to the car analogy. But I do see this happen sometimes in conversations around when it comes to people. I'm curious the delta between what you can design in a computer simulated model versus reality. What is the accuracy between the two? Because I think sometimes there's a perception that, well, you just can't quite simulate things as well as you can in reality. We'll get to the human side of that. But in doing this for vehicles, how close could you get?
You get within 5-10%. And if you were so some simulations run only for a second or half a second, and some simulations run for hours. So
Okay.
that depends on whether you are talking about a crash event, or you're talking about a durability event where you drive the car for miles and miles and miles and see what breaks. But and how much of the difference you can tolerate, it depends on the use case. So in some use cases, you gotta have within 5%. In other use
Okay.
cases, 10% is close enough, because the simulation gives you a design direction, like which are you heading in the right direction or not.
Yeah.
Sole
Okay.
purpose isn't to match reality to like the thousandth decimal place, right?
Well, and I think that's an important distinction with this because when we talk about simulation or how these kinds of technologies can impact things, it's not necessarily, well, not necessarily, it isn't designed to replace the real thing. We're not looking to say, and I think sometimes that's where we get into these dystopian conversations where people go, oh, are we creating a world where we sit in a chair and never take a head? It's like, that's not what we're talking about. Simulation isn't designed to replace completely the thing, but like you said, to create trajectional direction and say, all right, hey, are we on the right track? Are there big things that we should get so we can refine it and get to a point where you're doing it? Is that fair?
That's exactly right. You have to always have a goal in mind. It's not just for its own, it's for some purpose. So in that case, the purpose is to design a car. In the case of learning, the purpose is to give somebody the targeted learning objectives, that now they understand this and now they can do this.
Okay. Okay. And that's where we'll talk about the shift. But I'm curious. So you're designing these simulations. You're figuring this out in terms of okay, if we can simulate a car on a track to be able to see how performance is impacted. What made you decide to make the shift and go, if we can do this for vehicles, why not do this for people? Because it's a natural transition, but I'm curious what for you was the catalyst to make that shift.
Yeah, it's actually very um, uncommon. So out of all my colleagues from that industry, I'm the only one who has made the shift. So it's not.
Interesting. So even though to me, because to me, it's just a natural, like, well, you do it for machines. Why on earth wouldn't you do that for people? But that's not necessarily a common connection.
So there's a couple parts to the question. One is, why shouldn't that be done by other people or somebody? That's that a lot of people can agree to that. But for me, the question was, should I spend the rest of my life trying to do this very difficult, challenging entrepreneurial thing, give up my job?
Yeah.
So for that personal question, I've always been kind of frustrated with the way classrooms and schools are. Initially, it was in India. We had a very nice private school, but it didn't have labs, and it didn't have any of the things that you would expect to find in labs. And I remember in seventh or eighth grade, I made a big deal about it. I wrote the letter, got everybody to sign it.
Raj is chewing out this district. What the heck? We're too busy sitting in classrooms. We need to actually practice this stuff.
Yeah, then I came to US, and it was vastly better, but still had a lot of room for improvement. And when I got into the simulation industry, I got to go to all these companies all over the world, and I saw how much resources they had. And I realized that, wait a second, all these car companies, plane companies, what they're really doing with our software is learning. That
Yeah.
was the moment when,
That's essentially
uh,
what they're doing. I mean, that's
that's what,
exactly what you're doing.
yeah. It's just that they're learning about their own products, but it just kind of validated that. So this technology wants to be used for learning, but the way everything is set up, it's just not being used. And so I thought I could make a difference, and that was the spark that me to
Okay.
change.
Okay. So you made the jump. So let's talk about what that, because when was that when you made the switch?
It's
2000 what?
2009.
2009. Okay. So as you made the switch and you looked at it, what, because it's been interesting for me watching the state of immersive technology and whether we're talking specifically simulations or just the immersive technology state as a whole, where was it at that time? So obviously I'm guessing the way it was handled in the automotive industry, specifically around vehicles, was different than where it was in the human simulation type of thing. So what was the state of things at that point?
So at that point in the training and learning, everything, the big deal was web. Can,
Okay.
if you remember at that time, web
Oh
was
yeah.
not as big as it became in the subsequent 10 years. So the big thing was trying to move things into the web. In the training and learning field, everything was text and image based, just slideware kind of
Yep.
content was there. There was no VR devices. Those devices started to come in 2016, 15, 16. So, but there was a smartphone, so there was a lot of excitement around the iPhone and the iPad. Um,
Yeah, because that would have been right around the time the iPhone was coming into the mainstream.
yeah, mobile was taking off. So, there was this feeling that if you could use those devices to do simulation based learning, that would be a big deal.
Huh.
And those were so my work was focused on that. Can we enable simulation in the browser?
So, well, and I think that's a really important distinction because yesterday I have not had a chance to go back and tackle some of the comments, but that still to me is one of the biggest misconceptions that exists when it comes to simulations and immersive tech is that in order to experience, and again, I get it. There are certain people that get really feisty if you start talking about VR and you say in a browser. They, some folks get really upset about that and they say that's not really truly VR, but that's not the point, in that there is still this perception that to start leaning into immersive tech or simulations, you have to be device specific. You have to be using wearable technology, which, as you just said, in 2009, I mean, it was there. There have been VR devices for quite some time now, but it was not in 2009. It was nowhere even close to even where it is now. So did you go into it with a, we need to go into this space, but we can't be thinking headset first? Was that from the ground up where you started?
I was not thinking about headsets at the time. So, you know, headsets are kind of secondary to my focus and our company's focus. Our main focus is on simulations.
Okay.
If you think about the Star Trek holodeck, that kind of thing. So, because simulations are, you are
Yeah.
interacting with it, you are actively, like 10 times a minute, you are thinking something and finding out.
You're actively doing something. This is going away from
Extreme.
this passive consumption to we're actually engaging you, you're participating, I guess would be a good way. It's very participatory.
Yeah. So, simulation is our main focus. And then the best way I think to experience a simulation is to go into VR, learning simulations, because then
Sure.
you get the full experience as real as you're walking into it rather than looking at it on a screen.
Yep. Okay. Okay. But at that time, because that's where I'm curious just from a trajectory standpoint, because with this work you did in the automotive space, were you using full immersive tech in that, or was it more desktop, mobile based simulation? I'm curious, I'm still
Yeah.
putting the pieces together for you
Right.
on that one.
So in the industry, there was something called a CAVE, which is an acronym
Okay.
for virtual environments. Basically, you take a big row, you have a lot of projectors and motion tracking devices, and you walk into the
Oh
room, you put on
yeah.
those glasses, and when you, so that that's the flavor of the car that was there. And if you surveyed, you would find that probably one point less than 1% or less than 0.1% of the time, simulation was being done inside of that environment. And all the other time it was on a workstation. Not no mobile because these simulations are very compute intensive. So you have to have a
Yeah.
machine or a powerful
Well,
works.
and the mobile devices of 2009 were not, of the early 2000s, were not what we have today. Not even close. I think my Apple Watch is probably more powerful than most of the smartphones of the early 2000s.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So then how did you see that start to change? Because I think it's interesting as I lean into some of this, how things have been evolving because it's been changing. And this is where some of these things that seem like new trends aren't really all that new, but they've been evolving along the way. So as you were progressing into this, you obviously leaned into this whole thing of going, we can do this for people, which I think is a really important capability. Because going back to what we're talking about, again, not getting into the whole learning styles discussion or debate, but really anybody would agree universally that we learn by doing. We don't learn by simply consuming information. We learn by actually doing this. So, how did that progress, or where were some of the stages as that moved forward? As you said, you know what, we need to start doing this. You know, what does a simulation look like in 2009 versus today?
Yeah, so initially, I thought that the best subject to focus on would be physics because it's a subject
Interesting.
that I enjoyed. It's a subject that vast numbers of people struggle with, and it requires you to interact. You, you do thought experiments. There's lots of stories of how great physicists did thought experiments, including Einstein, and that's how they figured something out. So we started out with targeting the force and motion and electrical concepts, the high school level and early college level. So those were very simple simulations, some particles flying around, force vectors visualized. And it was just
Okay.
very abstract. That was, it was working, but then I found out the difficulties of doing business with school districts. It's just a very difficult market to launch a product into.
Yeah,
Yeah,
tapping into the traditional education market, at least K-12 academic, is not an easy industry to break into, especially something as outside the box
right.
as simulations
Yeah. So, we didn't get anywhere for
and
first.
physics of all things. I'm it's just
Worst
like
possible
so
topic you can ever, because it was the smallest market of anything in K-12.
yeah, I was gonna say, so there was an adventure. Yeah, that was a lesson in the school of hard knocks right there of because again, going back to the opportunity is huge in my opinion. I think we haven't even scratched the surface on where this is going. But physics in K-12 is a pretty specific niche to try and experiment with it. But hey, I'm sure you learned some things along the way.
I learned a lot. What I learned is that I really cared about what I was doing and didn't really care so much about building a successful business. That was the
Yeah.
hardest. And
Well, and I think sometimes that's where passion and things we love can get in the way of what is actually needed or what will the market hold? Okay. So you went down the physics path and you went, this isn't going to work. Cause I was going to say, now we're talking corporate, things like that. So obviously there was a change in trajectory for you from K-12 physics for simulation into where you are today.
yeah, so I focused back on enterprise because we had to survive. Enterprise was a market that I understood. I'd spent 10 years in that market. So we
Yeah.
started to get customers and projects. And then we kind of went like that through all the way until 2016 when the devices, VR devices came to the
Yeah.
market. And by then I had all this experience that, K-12 has these challenges. And in the corporate training, we had learned a lot about corporate training as well, procedural training in manufacturing and health. And so we were able to I could see that VR was the technology that was needed to really have impact in training the workforce.
Okay.
Because what I had seen in the physics in the browser, it was too abstract. That was the most frequent complaint, is that students cannot connect, cannot abstract a human body with a particle or a car with a particle. That abstraction was very is a big challenge for that. Now, in a lot of
Yeah.
workforce training, it's very concrete. You just have to. So the best way to train for those settings is just take somebody to the factory floor or to the operating room. But that has obvious problems, very obvious issues of safety and cost and all that.
Well, and I think this goes back to sometimes I hear, and I think it's a fair critique of sometimes trying to digitize everything. Now, I know earlier on we talked about the fact that the goal of simulation is not to replace or eliminate the need to actually do stuff. Like, no, absolutely not. But is it a powerful way to get you the 80, 90% there? And I think this part that you're hitting on right now is this whole idea that sometimes you will get this. Sometimes people just need to experience the environment. And there's some truth in that, that I think, to your point, you can't necessarily put someone on a browser and go, "Here, do this," and they get the full experience. So I can see where the immersive capability suddenly said, well, now we could only get to maybe 50, 60%. Layer on the immersive tech, again, going back to like how far can you really go? How close can you get to the real thing? I can see the immersive tech now closes that gap from, yeah, we can maybe get you 50, 60% there too. Now we can get you 80, 90, maybe even 95 if we're really pushing this hard.
Right. In fact, our first project that came out of Canada was about architecture from the field of architecture. So how do you design in a hospital building? There's a medication room. How do you lay it out so that when nurses come there in a hurry, they're less likely to make mistakes, which has patient safety. So we
Yeah.
created a VR environment. People went in pretending to do all those tasks and collected data, and they compared it with people doing it in the real hospital environment. And they found that there was an amazing match between the two, but the
Yeah.
cost was 10 or 100 times lower because,
Significantly lower. Well, I think of an example of this that I had some good friends, a good friend of mine led the innovation lab at McDonald's for a period of time. And people aren't familiar with McDonald's, the science they put into how they run one of those restaurants is absolutely mind blowing. It's absolutely mind blowing what they do. And they have an innovation lab where they do what you described, where they set up the kitchen in all these different random configurations to try and optimize what is the best way. How do we reduce the number of friction, the amount of friction in assembling? And again, you might be like, assembling a burger, but it's down to a science of, if we can squeeze 2% more out of the organization, we can increase our profit margins. And it's brilliant, but it's extremely time and resource intensive when they have to flip that innovation kitchen and go, okay, we're coming up on McFlurry season. Where do we put the McFlurry machine? How does it fit into the workflow? It's extreme. And they've got to find people, and you got to fly them there. I mean, it costs massive, massive, massive amounts of money. And what you're describing I can see where it would reduce costs by exponential components. And what you're saying is that the correlation between, well, how much of a difference are we really seeing? It sounds like you can get extremely close.
right. That was because I came from enterprise where everybody is very hard nosed about ROI or things are not done. And so
Yeah.
that then in 2016, that was the project where I was able to combine VR and my enterprise background and show it's a published paper that there's ROI in that setting. And that was a big validation. Can do this with nurses in a healthcare facility, deliver ROI. There's going to be huge opportunities in all these different areas.
Okay. Okay. Now, 2016, I even think about where the immersive hardware was 7 years ago compared to now. Again, I still don't know that I see the wide scale adoption of the hardware. And I get it. To me, it's still in its awkward tweenage years a little bit. It's getting better. But how has that changed over the past, let's say, 6 years? And how is that starting to shape the possibilities? Because even some of the excuses of, well, XR, hardware is not accessible, those those justifications are quickly dwindling. Again, it's not that it's everywhere. We don't have a device in everyone's pocket like we do smartphones, but it's definitely growing.
So in 2016, uh, there were three main devices. One was the HTC Vive, which was a tethered device. You needed a PC and
Yep.
VR headset. It was big and heavy, but it was very good, very immersive. Then you had the HoloLens. So HTC Vive would probably cost you about $2,000 with the PC and the
Okay.
headset, everything. Then you have the HoloLens, $3,500 mixed reality device. worked great in many ways, had a lot of challenges. So these are
Yep.
the high-end devices, the high VR device, high-end MR device, and then you have the low-end devices like the Google Cardboard that take in a phone or uh,
Yeah, I remember when that came out. It was a big deal. Everybody, you could get a little piece of cardboard and slap your smartphone in it, and everybody had the possibility of having a VR device.
or you had the Samsung device. The Samsung had a similar thing. And then he probably had the Oculus Go maybe a couple years after that, which were very
Yep.
inexpensive, but not really a good VR experience. So yeah, this was the setting at that time. Now today, I'm just in LA where I tried out the Oculus Quest 3 in its mixed reality mode, and obviously it does VR. So you have a $500 device, which is probably competitive with the HoloLens in its mixed reality capabilities, and is, uh, I think, vastly better than the HTC Vive of 2016 in its VR capabilities. 500
Okay.
bucks, I think, in one form factor.
Okay. So
So
this is the Quest 3 that I because is that one on the market yet?
yeah, you can pre-order.
Okay. Okay. And that's what I mean. It's ready for pre-order. It's not something that's there. But so you would say the Quest 3 hands-on with the device itself is at the level of at least a more high-end mixed reality device? Because I think
Yeah.
that was another thing that as I've been watching the hardware space, it's been a little bit tough because there was this, well, do we invest in AR device? Do we invest in VR device? Are we really going to have both? And to me, it was a matter of time before we started seeing that emerging, which I think what Microsoft has done, I think Apple Vision Pro took a big step, but it sounds like the Quest is really actually making that even more accessible to anybody.
So $500. And there are some restrictions, like we cannot access the camera right now, but I expect that those will get relaxed. And then you have a $500 device that does both mixed reality and virtual reality, which is a huge deal. Untethered.
Oh, that's huge. That's huge. Well, and I think that's just it, is being able to flip between being in a fully immersive environment and then also being able to be in your regular environment while still having the capability of layering that on the top and being able to do a lot more with it. So, okay, so as we think about this in terms of the simulation though, and what people can use, I think the example we that you described is a really good one in terms of being able to kind of run these simulations of, hey, what if we were to do this? How are you seeing that shift into, because what I do sometimes see with business leaders, with L&D leaders, people like that, is there is this kind of niche area that they'll go, yeah, I can see how it could work in those environments, but it's usually a very narrow sector. And to me, I see way more opportunity for leveraging this. So where are you seeing success and where are you seeing larger scale adoption? Because again, going back to some of the things you've said, I've heard, yeah, high risk, high safety, things like that. And I'm like, no, this is capable of simulating. We should be doing simulation and active learning in far more than just some of these niche use cases.
I think that I've had some interactions with people at large companies, and they're they're like typical overserved people. They're not hungry to try out new things. They're very relationship focused. And I think that's not a good thing to accelerate innovation. Uh, have much. I have a very different experience when I work with smaller organizations that really have a need. They're very constrained for budget. The traditional methods are just not working for them. They really have a problem. And in that setting, I find that all of these standard objections that you just mentioned, a lot of people are
Yep.
raising, are off the table like immediately because these people really have a problem. And I can give you some examples from different fields, like a manufacturing facility in South Carolina, healthcare training on the West Coast, even classroom education. So I would say that the big difference is being an overserved or an underserved group.
Okay.
And for the underserved groups, where the problem is significant, people are really passionate, they want change now. There's like all the reasons are there to try out VR. And, and
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. Well, and so I want to follow up to this, but Orlando, I'm jealous because Orlando has his. He got his Quest 3. He said it was delivered 2 hours ago.
Yeah,
So
ours is coming today too.
oh, yours is coming today? Darn it, man, we should have gone live 2 hours from now. Maybe you coulda, like, popped it on and we could have actually
Yes.
done a walkthrough with it. Yeah, and so your point, though, on the opportunity to experiment with some of this stuff, I think there is, you know, greater opportunity for us to think about this, especially around what you said in terms of, where really are you running into some of these problems that people need to practice? Going back to the very beginning of this conversation, where are people completely off track and we need to just change their trajectory? And the way we can change their trajectory is by putting them in a situation where they actually get to play that out. And is it a replacement for them actually doing it? No. But anybody who's been in any sort of field, whether that's formally in learning and development or even just in a business leadership position where you're trying to change people's behavior, it is hard work to change people's behavior. It is not something that you just do because you send out an email or you put together a well coordinated video that explains to people, hey, here's what we need you to do now, go do it. There's actually a lot that it takes to get people to start getting comfortable with it, being able to execute against it, practicing, failing, because inevitably, no matter how small the change, you're going to make mistakes along the way. And that sometimes the stakes are too high to risk doing that in a real environment.
So I think the question is, where have we seen success in that question?
Yeah. I mean, where are you starting to see some of this adoption for folks that is outside the traditional, like I think of environments where, aviation. Yeah, we use VR for training our pilots. Well, of course you do,
Okay,
high risk situation. But where are some of those ones where it's starting to expand out beyond that?
sure. I'll give you three examples from three different fields. One is from manufacturing. So uh, I was at a workshop at Georgia Tech. I sat at the table with a gentleman who was leading workforce training in South Carolina. He talked about his present. So we were all giving presentations. His presentation was basically that there's a big company there in the state that is hiring people. Their training process and the work is such that people quit in 1 day, 2 days, sometimes even the same day. These are well-paying jobs, but people are not really able to stick to it. So we spoke afterwards, and I told him about VR, and he said that he was looking for vendors and he was getting quotes from Canada and other places. And so within a few months, we started working with them. And within 3 months after that, we had a system running. What that did is um, it shifted the training from a noisy, dangerous factory floor into a nice, quiet, air-conditioned room where now, if you are the person who just joined, you're not overwhelmed by that. So half the reason that people leave so quickly is that they get overwhelmed by the actual job condition. Now that you are training in a calm environment, uh, you're able to do as many reps as you want without wasting raw material. So that's where a lot of the ROI comes.
Okay.
Also, the environment is so bad that you have to have earmuffs. Now you can't hear the expert, what they're trying to tell you. I mean, it's just night and day difference between what their business as usual training process was and what the VR based training process was. So there was a huge
Okay.
ROI. There's a case study on our website. So that's a manufacturing example. And there's
Now, with that
also,
example, were they going all in from an immersive standpoint with the wearable
yeah,
devices as well? Okay.
yeah. They had a VR headset. They also had a tool in their hand, which had a tracker attached to it. So to build the
Okay.
muscle memory, because the tool is like 10,
Yep.
15 pounds. So that's one example for manufacturing. And we have so many conversations going on manufacturing, all kinds of manufacturers. So that's one category. Then the other one is in healthcare. So we had a healthcare client that was under a lot of pressure to roll out a new training, which had to do with soft skills, what to say, what not to say. And they really wanted to use AI, conversational AI. They didn't want
Okay.
the traditional click on this button kind of thing. They didn't have faith in that.
Yeah,
So
the really bad, like, simulation where it's choose the most obvious answer because the other 3 are, like, not even close type of thing.
so
Okay.
they wanted a 3D simulation. They wanted conversational AI so that the system could understand what they're saying, what the user is saying. LMS integration, and it should all run in a browser because they couldn't buy so many
Okay.
hits. So
Okay. So for them, for them, it was starting outside of, the actual full immersive environment.
because they had to roll it out to 1,000 plus people in a remote setting. So so that
Okay.
was so what they really liked about our approach is that yes, today you can do it in browser, but tomorrow when you have headsets, all the same content will promise, will guarantee it
Okay.
works in the headsets. They're like, so that's the second example. And then the third one is from K-12. So after we found our footing in the enterprise and we are doing well,
You came
uh,
full circle.
so we connected with a school superintendent at a conference, and he talked about the problem of career exploration. So you have a lot of
Yeah.
young people who are first generation, in any career, and for them, there's a lot of psychological barriers that keep them from being able to imagine that they could do this job. So
Yeah.
and if you take them on field trips and stuff, that you do that once a semester or once a year, it's not enough of an exposure that somebody can change their mindset and see themselves in a new role. So he was convinced that VR is the way to go, but he was looking at proposals from other companies that were just very to us looked very expensive. And I still have the memories
Okay.
of early days of doing physics. So what I said to the team is we came so far with the no code platform, but we need to really take another step and build a lot of content using our own tool. Otherwise, we're not going to have the kind of impact in the community. And so we said to the superintendent that what if we build 10 of them in a month? And he said, "Wait, that's not possible because the other company is going to come to me next year." So we built 10 a month for 3 months. And now we have 30, 40 simulations and they're super
Okay.
happy. And we gave it a new product name. And so we think that, bringing the world of enterprise and the world of classroom, VR can bring these two worlds together
It
in a
can
way
bridge the
that
gap.
possible to do in any other.
Well, and so one of the things that you hit on that I want to reinforce, and then I want to also talk about how AI is changing some of this stuff, is the fact that the future focused lens on immersive tech of you may be in a situation where you need to get started with a browser based, and that's totally reasonable. I think there's a lot of people I know that I encounter, businesses, learning leaders, who are going, we aren't yet at a point where we have the infrastructure or the comfort with the hardware. Going full immersive is not where we are today. And that's okay. And I think sometimes that's an artificial barrier people see is, oh, well, we can't do that. So we can't participate in any of this. And that's just not true. But I think what you're pointing out with this is it is an opportunity to be future focused in this by laying the foundation of saying, hey, if we can get people to start thinking about simulation and experiential change, then as the hardware, as the technology matures and becomes more readily accessible, flipping the switch and taking this from 50 to 60% and turning the volume up to 80 to 95%, you're not reimagining your strategy all over again. You're literally just flipping a switch.
Exactly.
Okay. And so then the other one, which quick flip back and then we'll jump to this next piece. But what's interesting about that was I think about this from my experience at GE when before the pandemic, there was a lot of effort. I was driving hard to say we should think about hybrid experience, which I've been driving that since before it was a popular trend. But it was really about saying it shouldn't really matter where people are. We should be able to reach them wherever they are. And by designing that way, you can flip the switch between, well, if people happen to be in proximity to each other, you do it this way. If they don't, you just run it like this. And so when the pandemic hit, flipping a switch was extremely easy. And I see a similar parallel here to saying, if you get in the mindset of simulation, if designing for experience, then when the hardware changes, you're literally just toggling to a new device. And yes, that'll
Yeah,
have its own challenges, but it's not rebuilding your whole strategy.
absolutely.
Okay. So then let's talk about how AI is impacting this. Because going back to something I said in the very beginning, and I'd love your take on this, when generative AI came onto the main stage at the end of 2022, it really did suck the air out of the room. And everybody was on the, open AI bandwagon. And again, I love open AI. I use it all the time. But there was this limited thinking about what it could do. And it was really about, well, how's it going to write more content? And I think there's largely still a lot of focus on how it's going to generate more consumption of content versus the possibilities of it can do a heck of a lot more than that. So I'm curious, again, not that generative AI was new in 2022. So I'm guessing you were toying around with some of the possibilities before 2022. But how has that changed the possibilities in terms of, because even just what you described, spinning up 30 simulations in 3 months, 5, 10 years ago, that would have just been an insurmountable task. That would have just been something that very few people could even imagine doing.
So these are shorter simulations. These are 3 4 minutes. Um,
Even still,
yeah, so yeah, that's made possible mainly by our no code platform. So the key to
okay.
accelerating is first of all have a no code platform. Then you can use generative AI to even further speed that up. So, but before I go into that, let me answer the question about like how does this change things. So yeah, the baseline, I'll go back to 2017. So when we first started, when we are playing with these devices, earlier devices, and I just imagine the future. What I saw was that in in all my learning experiences, I was never fully alone. There was always a teacher or a classmate or
Yep.
two. And you always have all these people, and in this social setting, you are, building your understanding. Yeah, you go off and read some stuff, but then really the learning is
It's a
happening.
community based. There's a lot of community based learn. I mean, and there's tons of science behind how important
Right.
it is to have a community around you when it comes to learning.
Right. So I saw that having AI agents was a fundamental piece of immersive learning because if you require actual people, you haven't fully digitized. Right? You fully
Yeah.
digitized. You say, don't need the facility, I don't need the equipment, and I also don't need the expert, or at least I don't need the expert around me all the time, 100%. So
Okay.
that you free up the expert to help more other students. Right? So that was the main reason why we started playing with conversational AI back in 2017. So AWS and Google had some basic services for low level stuff like speech recognition and text to speech. And then we were trying to have our own kind of brain. And that was very challenging. So,
Yeah.
so when we saw GPT-3 come and 3.5 and 4, it was just it's like we were handed this dream tool that we ourselves could never build. It is so challenging, but now we had it, and everything around it was already baked in our mind. We knew that
Okay.
we're going to use this technology to instantiate a role play helper with you, or a
Yeah.
teacher, or a coach, or a
Almost a coach. In some ways, almost a digital coach to be there alongside you along the way.
So what we did is we took the no code platform and we added functionality in it so that now the content creator author can just imagine, I want an AI agent for this role or that role or the other role. And under the hood, we take care of all the integration with GPT-4, which is the version
Okay.
we use. But that's been really exciting because the dream that I had back in 2017 cannot be realized thanks to this amazing technology that we have.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of videos about it.
Well, and it's interesting because I think back to it was probably 17, 18, and coming into like 19 and 20, where I was toying with some of these conversational AI capabilities. And to your point, I have to imagine it just changed the game with things because when you were playing with these in their earlier days, they weren't super fast. They weren't quick to respond. They took a bit to process what you said, and it felt a little bit clunky. And I know that there were some immersive experiences that I went through that they had tried to start attaching some of this stuff. And I thought it was fair feedback when people poked it apart a little bit and went, that wasn't terribly it wasn't a great experience. And it was like, well, no, it wasn't because that's where the technology is. And it takes a while for it to really understand what you're doing. And it's not terribly mature and it doesn't have the large language model behind it to just move it at the pace and accuracy you want it to. But as these GPT models started advancing so quickly, my initial thought was, holy moly, we're going to be able to augment these digital experiences with not necessarily replacing humans, but augmenting them with a digital version, an assistant who can actually accelerate and make this feel far more realistic.
There's a huge problem of teacher shortage.
Yeah.
Yes,
And there still is. I mean, to be honest, there still is. This is a
there
huge
is.
gap.
And it's very industry specific. So when I talk to people in the electric vehicle industry, it's unbelievable crunch because you don't have enough people who know how to repair these vehicles. And like if you get in a collision with your electric vehicle, fixing that is very different than fixing the car 10 years ago, the gas engine car.
Yeah.
Um, Different safety risks and so on. Same thing with
Well, and that's an important clarification that when you say there's a teacher shortage, people who watch or listen to this may automatically think just specifically like K-12 teacher.
no,
That's not what we're saying. We're saying subject matter expertise. There's a shortage in that I mean, and that hits all industries, all
all
roles
industry.
across the board.
Yeah.
There's a lack of people who actually can take that knowledge and that experience and say, "Let me actually coach and develop somebody to do whatever that is."
Yeah. And then in manufacturing, we often hear about skills gap. So you have the one generation of workers retiring really fast, and another
Yep.
generation
Yeah, the
is
gray
coming up.
tsunami is
Yeah.
crushing some industries.
So there's that shortage. Then you have the chips, the semiconductor industry that is coming back to the U.S. How are you going to grow an entire workforce that fast? That's the challenge. And then in K-12, so I was in New York City speaking with some of the school administrators, and I was shocked to hear projections like, oh, the public school system in the US could collapse in 5 to 10 years. I was like, wait a second, repeat that. And my kids go to public school. And they explained this dynamic, this kind of vicious circle spiraling. I don't want to get into it because I'm not sure I can do a good job of explaining that. But it was real enough that I remember the feeling. It's like, oh my God, these are respected leaders in that industry. 10% of the classrooms, I was told in LA today, don't have a teacher because there's a lack of qualified people who can do that job.
Yep.
And so this is a big problem. Whether you have a teacher who is exhausted or you just don't have a teacher anywhere on the spectrum, I think that we should work as hard as possible to use generative AI technology to assist all these teachers. Like in COVID, the nurses were overworked and burnt out and so on. And it's the same thing with teachers and experts in every industry. We need to build tools to help them.
Well, and going back on some of these overall workforce and just kind of economic trends that I've been watching and following, there was and has been this desire to resurrect or kind of bring back into the mainstream this idea of apprenticeship and that whole model of how do we actually do this. But to your point, one of the biggest bottlenecks for that is there's a lack of people who can actually apprentice and coach these people into these different fields and actually grow. And it's a major shortage that is hitting a lot of places. And even going back to corporate learning leaders who may listen or watch this later, I don't think I can think of a single time where I've encountered, advised, or been involved with an organization that went, we've got enough resources to cover everything. We literally are nailing it. All our skills, we've got enough people to coach people. We've got enough resources to develop the environments. We've got all, there just isn't enough. And I think sometimes it's important to remember that because this is where what that scarcity mindset can creep in and go, I'm scared of where this is going because will there be enough left for me to be involved? I hear AI assistant and I think, does that mean my job goes with it? And I just look at that and go, "Are you kidding? There is so much to do, and there is such a shortage. That is not a concern for me whatsoever."
Yeah, the focus, well, we try to focus, in any situation, you can focus on so many different things and you'll get the results depending on where you focus. In this case, the focus should be on the kids, the workforce. If we don't invest in building better tools for them, we are really doing a disservice. So that's where the focus
We
has to.
are. So on that topic though, because I want to talk about the accessibility of this. And I want to make sure I leave enough time for us to talk about some actionable steps that people can think about with this. Because hopefully, anybody who's listening or watching and thinks, I don't think this is really that big of a deal, or this isn't that important, or this isn't really an opportunity, hopefully you've changed your mind at least a little bit. We got some work to do. And if you don't follow up with me, I'm happy to have a deeper conversation on it. But I also want to talk about the accessibility of this because to me, we talked about this backstage, but this is a huge component where some of the things we've talked about, I don't know that I've ever encountered anybody that says this opportunity for experiential learning, this opportunity to develop, get a chance to hands on practice, do this. I don't know anybody who goes, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's a good thing. Unfortunately, it's often been very inaccessible for most people. And to me, this is a huge area where what we're talking about now, not only is it addressing the gap of, well, there's just not enough people to coach, teach, and develop these people, but furthermore, it's not accessible to the masses using analog or traditional methods where this is.
Yeah. So equity and access are probably the number one value that are driving our work. We do the engineering, we take joy in that, but what is it for? Like, why is it meaningful? The meaning comes from equity and access. And so we work very hard to keep the prices as low as possible. So of course we have to pay Amazon and we have to pay salaries, but we're trying our best to make sure that our product is so affordable that people, you know, anybody can buy it. To put it very simply, I can say back to the K-12 example. So they had a proposal from another company that was charging $5,000 for 1 year for their software to run on one VR headset. So you have a $300 device and a $5,000 software that powers that device for 1 year. And that's not a price point that is accessible to all the school districts, given their budgets and so on. So, and this was the thought. You remember back in India when I was in a private school, but there was no lab and there was no equipment in it. And it's something that I think that digitization can make a difference. Now,
Yeah.
every kid can have, a lab that has $10 million worth of equipment in digital form. Every tool, every device is there. And such a software can be made available for nothing, almost nothing, to every kid in the world. So other companies like Meta have brought the hardware price down. An amazing
Yep.
piece of hardware, very low. We are doing part of bringing the content price down. But besides price, there are other things to accessibility. Like, what if somebody wears glasses and the frame is too
Yeah.
big? Well, there's the web version for that. Right. So we take care of
Yep.
that. You have to work on accessibility at every level, and that's the way to make sure that we have it.
Okay. Well, and I think this goes back to that omni-use capability of what we talked about here, which is you can have this now be I mean, I think back to the days when you used to have to go, are we designing this for desktop or mobile? And that used to be a thing you actually had to drive requirements for to determine, well, are we going to have resources to do both? Which one do we prioritize? And now with responsive design, responsive technology, you don't have to think about that. You just design once and it flips for all of that. And I think that's a huge advancement for the accessibility conversation of, yeah, you know what? If somebody is not comfortable in a headset, that doesn't have to be a barrier to it. Where I know some platforms and some technologies I've explored, they are very hardware dependent, and that can be a huge limiting factor. And I agree that's something that you have to watch for.
Right.
So as we come into the home stretch, I want to spend the last couple minutes here for folks who may be thinking about this, because one of the things that I think is really exciting about this is you may be in an organization where you are nowhere near, in your mind, you're nowhere near this because you think you're so far behind. But what's exciting to me about where the technology is today is the fact that in many regards, you can almost leapfrog some of the things that you used to. It's not this linear process of, well, before we get to simulation or immersive learning, we have to do all this other stuff. It's like, well, no, you actually might be able to just jump straight to it. What are some actionable things that people can do to get started with? wh- I mean, where do people get started? Where do you recommend people get started with this kind of thinking?
So specifically in our case, the simplest thing is to get in touch with us on a call, talk about kind of what their needs are, and then lay out, give them recommendations on how they can immediately or as fast as possible start working with this technology to help more people unlock the benefits of AR, VR, and AI powered training. That's kind of our mission statement. But there are other companies also. A lot of companies do VR, AR training, and you're reaching out to any of them and starting conversations with. But if you're not ready to have a conversation, there's a lot of material on the web. We have a lot of case studies on our websites and just kind of start to look at kind of content or listen to shows like this to become aware of what the benefits are.
Okay. Well, you know what? I'm not going to argue with you plugging for people listening to shows like this because that really is the goal of this, is as I have these conversations to help people be more future focused and to think about, hey, here's where things are. Here's where we are today. But what does that mean as we triangulate where do we want to be? Because ultimately, there's an opportunity for us to, so often, I think we get so focused on what's right in front of us, we tend to try and skate to where the puck is instead of trying to think about, okay, but where's the puck going to be? Because the reality is, no matter what you're doing, it takes time and resources to get up to speed on this. And if you're always just going to right where we are today, you're always going to be behind versus seeing, okay, if this is where things are at, how do I stay 3 steps ahead? I am, and I think my additional thoughts on this is, and I'm curious your take. We've only got a few minutes, but there is something different. And you had this experience because you were designing simulations. There is a skill difference for somebody who can think about and deconstruct an experience into a simulated environment than just how do I tell people information? And I do think that there is a bridge that people have to cross to be able to say, how do you actually deconstruct an experience? And instead of just going, I'm just going to give you a bunch of information, to actually do the hard work of thinking about, well, what really goes into that? What are the environmental factors? What are the measurement things that I should be looking for to see, was this effective or did we drive the right change? Any tips or suggestions for folks to help them bridge that gap?
Yeah, it's a really important point. The skill required. I hear a lot of people expressing a lot of concern that, oh, even with no code tools, it's very complex to build simulations. I mean, some of that is true. But yeah, we have to always remember that what's the goal here? The goal is to have some other human being have a better learning experience. Yeah, learning is one of the hardest thing that people do because you're going to put something in your mind for a long period of time. It has a lot of cost. And why should you put this thing in your mind and not some other thing? And so because the but it can change somebody's life, right? So you have to be willing to take on a little bit of effort and learn some new tools. You really care about the kind of experience that people have. There's no getting away from it. Now, in our company, we have been working very hard for 6 years to make it easier and easier and easier and easier. And we also look at other companies making similar tools, big companies, tens of billions of dollars worth of market cap. Nobody has gotten to the point where it is as easy to make an immersive interactive experience as it is to write a Word document or a PowerPoint slide
Yeah.
or even an articulate storyline. That problem is still open, but it is vastly easier today. So we have a training class called XR 101 where you come and by the end of the first hour, you have made your first AI powered VR experience. You're looking at VR experience. You can email it to anybody. So as an engineer, I know that we have a long way to go to make it easier and easier. But yeah, it's a little difficult. That also means job security because in 3, 4
Yeah.
years, you can just tell generative
Well,
AI
that's
what
the thing, to your point, and I think that's a really good point because this is, again, is there a different skill set? Yes. And my take on this when I've coached people on this is it's about learning how to ask really good questions and deconstruct work and actually really get a deep understanding of what really is going on here that we're trying to impact. And that takes practice and skill. And to your point, but that's job security and getting good at that and being able to say, hey, we have this problem, and being that person who can lean into that and go, help me understand. what is happening and who can learn about that environment and see the human factors and see the environmental factors and then say, I think I know how we can recreate this in a way, figure out what the most important variables are, and we can actually show and help people move along that trajectory. To your point, that is job security, even in an AI age. I mean, forget AI. Out of AI, it's job security. You stack AI on top of it, that kind of interaction, that kind of work, that's deep, higher order work that will future proof you as a professional.
Absolutely. Very well said.
Okay. Well, with that, I could keep going on this for a very long time. For anybody who is made it this far, if you're watching and listening, again, I would encourage you to sign up for my Substack where I'll be sharing the digestible version of this, but I'd also encourage you to check the live replay of the whole thing because we hit on a lot of really good stuff. Raj, I'm so glad I had you back. It was awesome to be able to dig into the immersive tech and simulation space. Again, I feel like I've had too much of a break from that space and I've missed it. So thank you for being here and sharing where things are and where we can anticipate being in the coming years.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Always great to talk.
All right. Have a great one. Thanks, everybody, for your time. Thanks for listening and watching, and we will see you next week.